Hello, world singers. My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is Cosmere Conversations.
Hello again, all of you lovely friends. We are back with another episode, this time looking at everyone's greatest friend, Mr. Hoid.
And specifically, the stories that Hoid tells. We're going to start a little mini-series about these stories, looking at potentially what their significance is now that we know a little bit more about the Cosmere and Roshar, etc., because we all know whenever Hoid is talking, we are looking for the hidden meanings.
So we are going to have the next few episodes all fall under this banner of the stories of Hoid, Hoid's parables, life, the Hoid story. I just had to keep going until I got you to giggle.
I was going to call these Rosharan folklore, but I'm not convinced that they are all actually Rosharan.
Especially when we get to things like the dog and the dragon.
Exactly.
Which, no dogs on Roshar.
Exactly. So now we're calling these Hoid's parables because I do feel like they are maybe more specific to Hoid, and as parables do, have some underlying meanings.
Today we're going to split the episode into talking about Fleet and Wandersail. We're going to go roughly in order.
Semi-chronological order.
Yeah, but we might feel free to jump to some of the other Hoid sightings across the Cosmere. He has a small story that he tells in Warbreaker to the God Court and Ciri specifically, so we might jump over there as well. But as most of us know, Hoid is most often found in the Stormlight Archive, so we're going to begin there with Hoid's two stories that he tells to Kaladin in Book 1 and Book 2.
Let's start with Fleet. This story is told in chapter 59 of Words of Radiance, if you at home would like to crack open your book and read along, so to speak. And in this chapter, Kaladin has been put in prison for, being an upstart Dark Eyes.
And, threatening or challenging in public, threatening Sadius via Amaram, and the duel that just ensued. So it's a big moment. Kaladin's feeling down in his prison cell, as Kaladin often does.
One of his more down times.
Of course, his bond with Syl will be tested in Words of Radiance, and we see in this chapter some of the fractures kind of starting to begin. But Wit, being good old Hoid himself, comes to visit Kaladin, appearing as if out of nowhere, with maybe a bench in tow. I'm very confused.
I don't think he brought the bench with him.
Kaladin says something like, was the bench even there a second ago? But I digress. Hoid comes to Kaladin and, in a very Hoid-like way, begins to tell Kaladin a story while Kaladin is informing Hoid of kind of the plot points.
Yeah, he is kind of asking for audience participation.
Yeah, wasn't there a Middleditch and Schwartz Netflix comedy special that was like an improv? People shout out in the audience and then they turn it into a story. That's basically what Hoid is able to do. He is both a Middleditch and a Schwartz.
Before Hoid begins telling the story, we do get an interesting little observation / quote where, quote, he hummed softly to himself and nodded. Perfect pitch, Wit says, makes this all so much easier than it once was, end quote. So obviously, big hint that at this point, Hoid is holding at least 200 breaths to have perfect pitch.
And this is one of the major clues that Hoid is collecting all of the different, or has already collected all of the different types of investiture. We say these things a lot and we reference a lot that, oh yeah, just Hoid has this stuff. And for those looking for the actual moment, this is it. In the story of Fleet is when we get that hint that Hoid has so many breaths.
One of many.
And then
yes.
Yeah, and it's a hard confirmation. And then let us go into the story proper.
Yes. Hoid begins telling this story about a man named Fleet, who is said to be the best runner there has ever been on Roshar, and he is this like mythical hero in many ways. He has been said to race the heralds, and he just always wins no matter who he is racing.
Fleet is Benny the Jet Rodriguez.
Yes.
He has put on his PF flyers. He is guaranteed to run faster and jump higher. And as Wit does, he's telling the story with a little bit of the Yolish light magic and kind of weaving the story into Kaladin's reality.
So Fleet begins to race the high storm. He's decided he is going to beat the storm. He's going to run all the way across the continent ahead of the storm.
I'm going to keep this Sandlot reference going because the high storm is the beast. There it is. And just across town is across all Roshar.
Yes.
It's so perfect. It lines up so well.
It's really good. I love this. You are Yolish light weaving for me right now.
By just retelling the story of the Sandlot.
Yes.
Clearly, this is going to be Fleet's greatest task, and as he runs and keeps running, we get the vivid descriptions that we will come to know in all of Hoid's parables, like this. Quote, Fleet stayed ahead, his muscles raw, eyes barely saw, legs barely walked, but on he went to destiny. The end you know, the end will live, a shock for men, to me you'll give. End quote.
So we've got this sort of poetic epic all set up. Fleet is running, and as Hoid says, the end will live, which like makes you think that, you know, Fleet is going to go down in infamy as the hero. There are also some just interesting little things that I want to kind of pull out of this. One is that he's like racing towards his destiny. Like whatever happens at the end of this story is his destiny, which is like, you know, meant to be his reason for being or whatever. So I think that's just sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind, that this specific race is Fleet's destiny. And then there's another tiny part right before that quote that you just read, actually, which is, quote, his feet did blur, his soul a sun, end quote. And it's capital S soul, capital S sun, which I just thought was interesting. I kind of understand capital S soul, but I thought the capital S sun, it just like jumped out at me. And I was just wondering, like, is he a shard vessel? Is he a dawn shard or something that he is like glowing in some way?
An interesting thought, because certainly we feel with all of these stories and all of these parables that the characters are historical in some way. Like they actually existed. That's at least the vibe that I get.
That's what I think. And like that's why we're looking at these now, is to say, like, can we discern if there is some truth in these stories? Are they more than just fictional stories Hoid is telling to inspire Kaladin?
Because in Rosharian lore, Fleet actually races a herald, the patron of the Deathbringers, Hanorok.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting thing to like keep in mind or to remember. And I started thinking about what the sort of metaphorical significance of that could be. Hana is the herald. She's the patron of the Dustbringers. So like that's interesting. In certain ways, Fleet is like racing against destruction or decay, you know, which is sort of the realm of the Dustbringers. And then she is also known as the Herald of the Common Man. Someone calls her that in Oathbringer, I believe. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then she also has this surge of abrasion. So obviously more on like a surface level, that would make her very fast because she could just like slip and slide.
Now, the race is going to conclude in Fleet's death because, of course, Kaladin has to always
Kaladin kills him.
Yes. And that adds the both tension and humor in the situation that, Kaladin's just always feeling down, and Wit is not the person who is trying to bring him out of the slump. Like, he's not just going to like tell a happy story and being like, oh, you're down on your luck, Kaladin, but Fleet's amazing and you can be amazing too.
I mean, yeah, I think like that is the question, isn't it? Like, did Hoid have some sense that Kaladin would send the story in this direction? Because it certainly does seem like he arrives to tell an inspiring story to Kaladin to like, keep going, blah, blah, blah. And he somehow is still kind of able to tell that story, even with Kaladin's like Eeyorness.
Yes, and I think that is the great storyteller aspect of Hoid, is that he is adaptable in this way we were talking about improv. He's just adapting to his audience and is listening and having empathy for Kaladin, and that allows him to change the story enough to make it work for the person that he is telling it to, instead of just like beating you over the head with the morals of the story.
Sure. Yeah, totally. So Kaladin like interjects and is like, he died. And
was that your just grumpy Kaladin?
Yes.
That was fantastic.
And Hoid responds, quote, he died? Well, I can work with that. Upon that land of dirt and soil, our hero fell and did not stir. His body spent, his strength undone. Fleet the hero was no more. The storm approached and found him there. It still and stopped upon its course. The rains they fell, the winds they blew, but forward they could not progress. For glory lit and light alive, for goals unreached and aims to strive, all men must try, the winds did see. It is the test, it is the dream, end quote.
Like so many parables in our own world, this is also describing a physical reality of the planet. It is giving a reason why the high storms stop at Shinovar. Where Fleet died is where the high storms do not progress onward. They have the wind blowing and the rain falling, but the storm dies where Fleet died. And as a recognition almost of the humanity, the line, all men must try, the winds did see, it is the test, it is the dream. It's the testing of yourself that is, the highest calling, or the greatest that one can reach. And the winds, which we should kind of think of as the Stormfather, like that's who's being tested and raced in this situation with Fleet. And so the high storms on Roshar do not progress past Fleet's death mark, is how I see it.
Yeah, and I think just it's kind of an illustration of the first ideal, of course, where the victory for Fleet is not in winning the race, but in the fact that he tried.
And I think this next line is actually kind of a precursor to what happens to Eshonai. Maybe not precursor, a little foreshadowing to what happens to Eshonai.
Yeah, no, I have some thoughts about this. Go ahead and read it.
Quote, his body dead, but not his will. Within those winds his soul did rise. It flew upon the day's last song, to win the race and claim the dawn. Past the sea and past the waves, our Fleet no longer lost his breath. Forever strong, forever fast, forever free to race the wind. End quote.
Okay, so we have this quote about Fleet's soul rising into the storm, which, yes, is similar to Eshonai, but I also found this word of Brandon. It is paraphrased, but user Zandy asked, is the Fleet story indicative of future events / the ending of Stormlight Archive? And Brandon answered roughly, yes, Hoid is telling Kaladin things that he needs to know, but Hoid's knowledge of the future doesn't necessarily extend that far. But I thought this was very interesting and made me think, like, is Kaladin going to ascend to be like the new Stormfather, or take up the pieces of honor that are in the storm or something?
Well, if we go with the theory that Kaladin is the son of Tanavast, That's a theory. It's not
a
hard
descendant.
confirmed. Yeah, a descendant of Tanavas' mortal vessel. And the Stormfather is holding honors Tanavas' cognitive shadow as like a, temporary...
And the pieces of honor.
And the pieces of honor. So if basically what the Stormfather is holding is what used to be part of Tanavas and the Shard as a whole, maybe Kaladin is a vessel enough for those pieces, because it's like part of Tanavast is in the Stormfather and that cognitive shadow, and part of Tanavast is also theoretically in Kaladin. So maybe Kaladin is the perfect person to rise to that situation. And at the end of his race, at the end
so
of
I'm
Stormlight
just
Archive, he dies, but then is risen.
Ascends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ascending to...
Oh, man. Big time spear-wielding Jesus.
I think that's a possibility. I think that there are some hints to that, but I am not 100% on board. That is a theory. I think that's kind of a popular thing that's out there enough where people are trying to connect all of these dots and the kind of similarities between Fleet's story about trying being the most important thing, even if it results in sacrifice, sounds very similar to what Kaladin's eventual story could be. Like, why am I doing this? What is the point of losing everyone? Everybody always dies. What's the point? And the point is to keep trying and to keep doing better.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said that, because when I read this story again, it really struck me how similar it is to the vision that Kaladin has of Tien at the end of Rhythm of War, and that the messages in this story and that vision are very similar. And of course, with all of us in our regular lives, you hear, you learn the same lessons over and over again until you really learn them. So Kaladin just keeps getting the same message until it sinks in. And in that vision, we have, quote, "Why do we fight, Cal? Why do we keep going?"
I don't know, Kaladin whispered. I've forgotten.
"It's so we can be with each other." And then that quote goes on to say, quote, "If he kills us," Tien said, "he simply dropped us off at a place we were going anyway. We shouldn't hasten it, and it is sad. But see, he can't take our moments, our connection, Kaladin. And those are the things that really matter." End quote.
Clearly, Kaladin, dealing with his depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, is constantly in this spiral of the way that like all of us have these thought spirals or can feel that depressive spiral where going through the motions is both like a blessing and a curse. Sometimes you go through the motions just to like get you out of bed in the morning, but also going through the motions, that repetitive pattern is and can be very destructive in the way that like the bridge runs were a repetitive pattern that like always in the same way, and Kaladin constantly processing that trauma over and over again is only compounding how bad everything is that they are dealing with. And I think that Fleet's story about just like continuing to run up the mountains, down the mountains, into the valleys is reminiscent of that.
Yeah, I thought it was a good metaphor, actually, to kind of illustrate what maybe having depression can feel like, where Kaladin is kind of always in a race, always trying to outrun his depression. And there are some days where, Fleet is running downhill. In the story, Kaladin's running downhill and everything's easy and the wind's at his back, and like, yes, he's still working, he's still running, but it's a little bit easier. And then there are some days where he's, completely exhausted, done, and yet he has, one more mountain range to climb, and it is incredibly difficult, but he keeps going.
The final end to the story is my favorite bit of Hoidism, which goes like this, quote, "The storm caught him," Kaladin said.
"The storm catches everyone eventually. Does it matter?"
"I don't know."
"Good." Wit tipped his sword up towards his forehead as if in respect. "Then you have something to think about." He left. End quote.
Because of course, knowing the moral to the story, knowing what is important and what matters and what doesn't matter, and if everything matters or nothing matters, is the ever-present question that we are all dealing with. And I think that Hoid telling this story, going through the back and forth method of telling the story with Kaladin, like providing, it's bringing Kaladin out of that depression that he's in prison and those terrible thought spirals about Amoram.
I don't think it works at this point. Like I said, I think, Hoid kind of tries to give him that message at this point, and Kaladin's like not ready to hear it. And he doesn't really hear it until Tien says basically the same thing, right? Hoid says the storm catches everyone eventually. Tien says we all end up in the same place anyway, And it's not until 2 books later that Kaladin is finally like, oh, I get it.
Yes, and you have to have multiple setbacks between this point and that point. But I love that connection to what Tien says in Rhythm of War and how it does feel like Kaladin has come to a pivotal character growth point with this 4th ideal and his position now going into book 5. It feels like he's going to have a whole book of Kaladin. I don't want to necessarily say at his best, but like I think we're going to see peak Kaladin here. I don't know if that ends with his death or some type of ascension, but like I'm pretty sure that we're going to have this bookend from book 1 where we see Kaladin the slave to book 5 where we see Kaladin the 4th ideal and maybe 5th ideal and maybe something else, Night Radiant. And another one of those stories that Hoid tells that I think is going to have or is having a big impact on the future Stormlight Archive story is Wandersail. And I know off mic we already disagreed a little bit about is the references that we've seen more recently about Wandersail connected to the original story. But let's go all the way back and then I'll try to provide the connection if it may exist.
So this story is in The Way of Kings, chapter 57. So again, roughly chronological order here. We're going back a book. Way of Kings, chapter 57. And Hoid tells this story of Darethil and the Wandersail. And Darethil is said to be a king from the Shadow Days, which is, quote, the time before memory. So I think that's interesting that we're already placing this before they would have had any kind of record of history anyway on Roshar, which just adds a little bit of like, maybe this is true because they don't have any records from this time.
Because of the story that Darethil is going on, he's commissioning a ship to sail through a high storm to kind of break out of the bounds of the reef sailing, when you're real close to the shore and you never kind of venture into the deeper ocean. Wandersail is supposed to be this magnificent ship that is able to ride the high storms in the seas.
Yes. So he commissions like the best ship that's ever been built in his day. And the reason that they are going out on this dangerous journey is to try to find the origin of the Voidbringers.
So I'm already like confused by this timeline in a lot of ways because we have high storms definitely precede human life on Roshar. They existed before the humans showed up. But we have the Voidbringers, which is both a story of the humans and a story of the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little bit wondering if Darethil is actually a listener. That this is a story about the listeners looking for the
origin of the humans.
Exactly. Like where are the invaders from and like trying to go and find that, and they have never left the shores. Kind of would make sense with the timing of the listener people. I'm just confused a little bit by like what the Shadow Days, like you arrived as a like fairly advanced race of humans from another planet doing this big transit. You would have had basic history, like you would have had basic record keeping.
Yeah, but things didn't survive the desolations.
Absolutely. And you have all those desolations that are breaking things up. So I'm just throwing it out there. I don't think that all of these need to be, as we said earlier, Roshar based stories or necessarily human centric stories.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point too, that this could be a story from a different planet, and Hoid is inserting words that will make sense on
Yes.
Roshar. So like, even I'm thinking, and I'm going to come back to this, but I'm thinking maybe this is a Scadrian story, and people from, Elendel, or the part of Scadrial that we see the most, sailed to like those southern tribes that wear the masks and stuff, and those are the quote unquote void bringers. I'm just throwing it out there.
Completely agree. I don't think that these necessarily all have to be what we see them on their face. Let's dive in, though, to the Wandersail and the story proper, because the voyage takes them to a ring of islands in the middle of the ocean that surround a giant whirlpool. And that whirlpool is supposed to be the location where the ocean drains, which is already, not something that we've seen on Roshar, but
Exactly.
I'm really excited to see that if it exists.
Like another thing where I'm like, I feel like this doesn't exist on Roshar. Like, we've seen maps of Roshar. There are no islands in the middle of the ocean like this. So, I don't know. Maybe, again, happened in the Shadow days, so maybe those islands just don't exist anymore. But I don't know. It just kind of seems weird. On those islands, they meet the native people who are called the Uvara, and they're described as having long, limber bodies and wearing clothing and accessories that are not found anywhere else on Roshar. So again, I'm immediately like, are these like maybe world hoppers? If this is taking place on Roshar, I immediately, for some reason, thought of the Feruchemists from Scadrial, because I think they're described as being kind of long and lanky, right?
Definitely tall and kind of lanky.
Like willowy?
Build. Yeah, a little bit. And weird clothing and accessories. That does definitely sound like Feruchemists with their different metal
I think they're described as having solid color robes, whereas the Feruchemists wear like patterned robes. Yeah. So there's a point against me, but
it's plenty of speculation, but I think it's fun. And I think this idea of a native people who both don't look or dress like anyone else on Roshar is important. But the more important thing that's going on this island and with this people is their intense devotion to their emperor and the emperor's quote-unquote rules.
Yes, because, of course, we've talked about this story a few times. This is a quite peaceful and pleasant society until Darethil and his crew notice that any tiny imperfection, even if you just trip on a little stone, is immediately met with brutal murder by your
peers.
Yeah, by your peers. And the reason for this that is given to Darethil is, quote, "Our emperor will not suffer failure," end quote. And that is like the line that is repeated to him over and over again every time one of these terrible murders happens.
While we have mentioned this story previously, I want to take a moment to really focus in on the horrific nature of what these people are dealing with, because we will eventually find out, of course, that there is no emperor that is forcing them to do these things, that the emperor died long ago.
Yeah, Darethil goes up to the tower and brings down this dead body and is like, "Look at your emperor." And then Darethil and his crew leave the islands. They flee with their ship that has been repaired. And I think this is important, and I didn't notice it previously. They take with them the person who was their guide to the islands, and her name is Nafti. And as they're like on the ship sailing away from the islands, we have this quote: "Holding a blanket around herself, staring with haunted eyes at her lands, she replied, 'Do you not see, traveling one? If the emperor is dead and has been all these years, then the murders we committed are not his responsibility. They are our own,' end quote."
Leading back to what I was saying about the horror of this circumstance that these people have found themselves in, the personal traumatic stress that someone like Kaladin is dealing with is here shown on a communal or, you know, a small societal level where all of the people at once are realizing the horror of what they have been doing to each other, not because someone was forcing them, which they could tell themselves as a way of like removing guilt and putting the blame on, oh, it's our emperor, he will not suffer failure. Like, this guy's real serious, not going to suffer any failure. No, that person didn't exist at all. That pressure that you felt, that compulsion almost that you felt to murder your friends and families and loved ones, was completely your own and coming from within. That to me just strikes right at the heart of, not only, we see it a little bit in Way of Kings, but it kind of continues to come back around in Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and in Rhythm of War, as more and more of the history of Roshar is unveiled to us and discovered. You have the listeners who are servants of Odium, sometimes, you know, directly taken over by the Fused, who can very easily say like, oh, we're not responsible for this. Like, we were slaves because the humans were terrible, and we were kind of slaves to Odium in a way. We see this with Moash, who's kind of giving a responsibility away to Odium. But we know, and we are biased, but we know that Odium is flawed. We know that there are decisions, there are listeners, the people we originally knew as the Parshendi, where Venli is now gone to, who chose differently, who made specific decisions to leave the fighting and to not participate and to not be in that situation where you're killing your family, friends, and loved ones, even if they might be separated by, you know, race or creed or species. That choice, because some people made that choice to leave the fighting, it almost puts more pressure on the people who stayed to like recognize their responsibility in all of the horrible actions that they are taking. Like, it's not just Odium's fault. It's not just because Honor is dead. It's because you're making bad decisions. Like, it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's hard to say because it's really hard for people to see outside of their own, you know, society or culture or religion. And that's why, like, in this story, it took a stranger, you know,
Yes,
someone from a completely different culture with different ideas to come in and like kind of pull back the curtain. But I think, you know, this goes along with the theme that we've talked about a lot of like changing perspective and the importance of like questioning everything, and how in Brandon Sanderson books, nothing ever is the way you think it is, even if there are historical documents to support your worldview.
Yeah.
Like, those documents can be altered, you know. And I thought this is interesting because you kind of mentioned honor as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, like, is this like a metaphor? Is the Emperor Honor, who has at some point, you know, gone a little bit crazy and is maybe holding people to unrealistic standards of perfection.
Not suffering any failure.
Yes, exactly. And then at some point they realize that Honor is dead and that they then gain a bit of freedom, maybe, that they are not being held to this like religion that they thought was guiding them.
Yeah, I definitely think we know that there exists this kind of basic conflict between the Skybreakers and the Windrunners at large, and Kaladin and Szeth on a smaller scale, of the doing what is right path or doing what is legal path.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in our own society, or anyone can kind of break that down in their own regards, because in a way, this is a story that is antithetical to the first ideal, and the more
which is that the end result is the only thing that matters. Perfection.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that Brandon as a writer is setting up this kind of conflict between do what is right or do what is legal. And I would say that Brandon sides more with the you need to do what is right, or you need to try to do what is right. Even if you fail, that's okay if you're trying to do what is right.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that Brandon is setting up the union of those two things. That
Okay,
we continue to come back over and over again to this fact that like swinging to either end of that spectrum is bad. Like the honor spren are doing bad things, and Nail and the Skybreakers are doing bad things, and like they need each other is, I think, more the answer to that question.
Yes, a unity,
yes,
being bonded together. But I believe that this story introduces this aspect of personal responsibility in a very horrific way for these people who are living on the island. But that concept of you cannot rely on someone else to tell you what you should be doing and tell you the actions that you should be taking. You cannot rely on your emperor, because your emperor might be dead and he might be taking bad actions in the name of a dead thing. But I also think that Brandon, not only in the Stormlight Archive and other Cosmere books, but also in the Skyward series that we are going over on our Patreon right now in a book club, if you want to join Patreon, or you can join any of our social medias. But I think this concept of trusting history, which you mentioned briefly, about like history or religion or your traditions or your laws, your legal system, all of these things can be ways of putting off your guilt and your responsibility to making personal decisions that are doing the right thing.
Yeah. So I think like maybe really the takeaway is that like you should always question, like always be questioning, to do the work of like really thinking about the structures that you live within and doing your own decision making and discernment process of what feels right or seems like the right thing to do, or determining in that way versus just following prescribed paths.
Yeah, you can't just give responsibility to someone else to lead you through all circumstances, because there are going to be moments in life when you are forced to make these difficult decisions. And if you've never questioned anything and it's just always been an authority figure telling you what to do, then when you have those difficult decisions, your only option is to rely on the authority. You like almost don't have the ability, because you haven't like trained yourself to go a different route. And that's why we kind of feel bad for these people, the Uvara people, who are trapped in this way, and it taking an outsider's perspective to like break open their mindset.
Which is also like a great PSA for like, don't be afraid of strangers. We need people who think differently than we do. An interesting word of Brandon on this, user Light Flame asked, can you give me a hint about Nafti, the Uvara girl that Darethil brought with him when he left the Great Abyss? And Brandon replied, there is more truth to that story than some may think. So, very interesting there. One, I need to know who Nafti's descendants are.
It certainly makes me question, and it certainly makes me wonder again about are these world hoppers? Are we on Roshar in the first place? Are we dealing with I don't know, like I could imagine a lot of crazy situations coming out of this. But for example, some of the mixed race people, the Horn Eaters being like maybe this is the beginning of their lineage or something like that.
Oh, because you're still thinking that Darethil might be a listener.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so if that theory was true, and then they went and got someone who was, from this weird human break-off group or whatever on these islands, then maybe that's the beginning of one of the peoples that we now see today. Maybe Nafti is the great-great-great-great-grandparent of Rock. And the interesting reason that I bring up Rock is because of what happened in Dawnshard with Rock's daughter being a key member of Risen's party.
Yes, that brings us to Risen. She also has a ship called the Wandersail.
This ship was built by Vistim to be one of the great merchant vessels and exploring vessels on Roshar.
Yes. So very similar to Darethil, Vistim commissions this ship to be the fanciest, most cutting edge ship of the time. And therefore he aptly names it Wandersail. And we get this quote, "A deed of ownership?" she whispered. "To a ship?"
Brand new, Vistim said. A 3-masted frigate, the largest I've ever owned, with fabrial stabilizers for storms of the finest Thalen engineering.
"Wandersail," Risen said, reading the ship's name. "Babsk, you are a romantic. Don't tell me you believe that old story."
One can believe in a story without believing it happened, he smiled.
End quote. I feel like Vistim does believe it. He's just like downplaying it for Risen.
And when we have this word of Brandon where we're learning that there's more truth to this story than some may think.
Some meaning
is
Risen.
So Risen doesn't know what's up. Vistim obviously does.
Yeah, and just like so appropriate. You know, these ships have like very similar origins. They are both taken out on these journeys of mythical proportions.
Yes.
You know, like give Dawn Shard another couple hundred years and it will sound just as far-fetched as Darethil's story. You know, this girl sets off on this cutting-edge ship to go to this island that like no one believes even exists anymore, and there's nothing there, and she finds, you know, all of these incredible things.
Now, I don't think that this is the case too much, but this is where my wild speculation comes in. Because we have weird things going on in the Cosmere when it comes to people moving around and stories being told. And maybe this is a tale from a different planet, or maybe
you're going to make this a time jumping thing,
is
aren't
a
you?
story from a different time. Exactly. Wandersail, the story, is based on Risen and the Wandersail.
You've officially completely gone off the deep end.
We have gone deep into the whirlpool where the ocean drains, and we're coming up with gold, people. Gold!
This is bronze at best.
I'm not making this argument as if it is actually happening, but I am simply saying that it is strange to me that we would get a ship actually named Wandersail. It would be as if a person
named it after the story appropriately.
Which is great. But I love a good bootstrap paradox where the story
Not everything is a time travel story.
It should be. No, it shouldn't be. It's ridiculous. I know it's ridiculous. It's completely silly. But I do think that the parallels between Wandersail, the ship, and Wandersail, the story. Yes.
I think it's more interesting that Vistim names the ship after this, you know, big mythical quest before Risen has been offered the mythical quest. So like, if anything, I feel like maybe that's an indication that Vistim knows something about the future.
Or about Risen specifically.
Yeah.
Because of her traumatic experience where she became paralyzed. Maybe there was something with the big gigantic turtle dude who is,
sure.
Like, Vistim has had interactions with those people in the past. Maybe that involved learning some stuff from I know it's not a lion turtle from Avatar, but that's always what I imagine. Wandersail is a haunting story. It's like really good for the spooky time of the year that it happens to be right now. And it is because it's a story, as we mentioned, about kind of rejecting authority or questioning authority. It fits so perfectly with all of these different characters who are constantly surrounded by authority, tradition, literal godlike powers that are forcing them into certain actions and behaviors.
Yeah, and then it's like, you gotta question everything all the way up the chain. Like, question the king, question your societal traditions, question the shards. Like, we've seen, they're not infallible. They have problems. They don't know everything. They can be wrong. You can't believe freaking anyone in these stories.
It is, of course, a question.
Ooh, including Hoid. Question Hoid.
Even when he's telling us great stories.
Yes.
it is, of course, the questioning and then answers that they get that breaks up the Knights Radiant when the truth is learned about the reversal of humans as the victims to humans as the conquerors and the oppressors. And so I think that Wandersail is the story, to me, that is going to have the most kind of long life in the Stormlight Archive. Maybe, maybe not.
We've got some good ones coming up.
We do have some good ones coming up, but I am saying this was from Way of Kings.
Yeah.
And I feel like it is still relevant. It's clearly at least mildly relevant because of Risen and her ship's name. And so I think that it absolutely could be something that continues not just to Stormlight Archive 5, which with Fleet, we kind of talked about how that could be paralleling Kaladin's journey, and maybe that ends with something big and Fleet-like in Stormlight 5. But I think Risen's story and the story of the Wandersail, like Risen could become a Cosmere sailor sailing across the Cosmere.
Yeah, Risen's obviously going to have some pretty far-reaching significance, it would seem. However, we are going to get to The Girl Who Looked Up and the story of the Moonchild. And those two stories, I think, have potentially even more significance to Stormlight Archive as a whole. So stay tuned, friends.
That's what we got coming up over the next couple of weeks. Really excited about these.
I have
Hoid
been
parables.
waiting for like 2 years to do the episode about the Moonchild. I'm very excited.
So it is happening. It is coming. Look for that episode coming up next. Always remember that you can find us on Reddit, Facebook, Twitter. Social medias exist everywhere. You can join us on Patreon to get double the episodes. Oh, so fun.
Until next time, life before death,
Strength before weakness.
journey before destination.